Hello friends, today we're going to talk about what you may need or may not need in order to learn to chant the Psalms like we're trying to learn to do. You can't read too much about chanting without running into the word Psalter. So, what is a Psalter? Do we need one, and where can we find one? What is a Psalter is easy. A Psalter is a particular translation of the Psalms with an eye to the poetry, the rhythm, and the meter of the original poems. If you are going to translate a poem into a new language, today the standard procedure is to find a poet who is fluent in both languages. That is because a poem is special not only because of the intellectual content, what it's actually saying, but because of how it says it. A poem is sort of like a picture on paper. The point is not just the message. The point is the message and the encapsulation, the rhythm of the words, the flow of the words, how it makes you feel, how the sound impacts your ear. And rhythm and meter are a big part of what makes a poem impactful to us. So if you have someone that's going to translate a poem and they're not a poet, but they're really fluent in the languages, then you get a sense of the intellectual content of the poem, but you don't get a sense of the artistry. So this happened quite a bit in translations of the Psalms. People would translate them that were language experts, but not poets. So in many translations, we have lost a sense of the original poetry, which is what makes the Psalms the Psalms. They are poems. They're songs. They're meant to be sung. They're meant to be said as poems would be said. So there arose a tradition in the Reformation and thereafter of translating the Psalms with an eye to the rhythm. The Psalms represent a pretty difficult case because it's scripture, and we want to preserve the meaning of the scripture as perfectly as humanly possible, and yet bring in a sense of the artistry of the original. So translating the Psalms into a Psalter is not easy, but it was deemed important by the Reformation and thereafter. See, before the Reformation, congregational singing was not common. There was definitely singing in church, but it was done by choirs. There were definitely singing at the offices, but it was done by monks and other clerics. Congregational singing was not a very important part of liturgical worship for a long time. It was, from what Scripture can tell us, at the beginning, in the first couple of centuries, congregational singing was common, but it sort of went by the wayside as time progressed. One of the outcomes of the Reformation was a renewed interest and renewed emphasis on congregational singing. And of course, central to that, along with the Reformation emphasis on the primacy of Scripture, is singing Scripture. And the Psalms are tailor-made for that. There are other things, of course. There are the canticles, like the Magnificat. There's plenty of poetry in the Bible. But the Psalms were made for singing in congregational worship, or at least most of them, the best we can tell, were written for that purpose. So the Psalms are a natural place to turn. So why do we need metered Psalms? The answer lies in the fact that it was for congregational singing. So if you've never really looked at your hymnal, allow me to show you something that probably is kind of cool, even if you've never seen it before. So this is a hymnal, and I tried to pick a hymn that is found in almost every hymnal, and this is a good choice. This is usually called "Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing," and most of you know it as being sung this way. Come thou fount of every blessing, tune my heart to sing thy grace. It's a very common tune, or commonly sung tune, very popular. But I want you to notice a couple things. The words here were written by a man named Robert Robinson. The music is, the tune is called Nettleton, and it says melody from a repository of sacred music. Now, notice the tune was written in 1813. The words were written somewhere between 1735 and 1790. This is pretty common. Today, the idea of a singer-songwriter is big. Someone sings a song that they wrote, and that's what people expect, especially in modern worship music, where worship leaders put out albums of songs that they have written. That is actually a really, really novel development in not only sacred music, but music in general. For the vast majority of recorded history, sung music came from two different sources. Someone wrote the music and someone wrote the words, but those were not generally the same people. There are exceptions, but generally that's not the case. So what we have here is the marriage of a poem with a particular tune. How do we do that? Well, if you notice down here at the corner, these little numbers, some hymnals include this information, some don't. But you have an 87.87, although strictly it's an 87 and then .87. That's actually what we call the meter of the hymn. It's the meter of the words. This is the amount of syllables per line, 8787. Let's see what that means. Come thou fount of every blessing. It's hard to get both my hands in the frame, but did you get that? That was 8. Come thou fount of every blessing. 8 syllables in the first line. Guess how many there are in the second? Tune my heart to sing thy grace. 7. So this little set of numbers actually tells you how many syllables are in each line, which is important if you want to sing these words to a different tune. You just find a tune that is set up with this that will fit this set of syllables, and you can sing these words to other tunes. For instance, come thou fount of every blessing, tune my heart to sing thy grace. That is not a common tune to sing these words to, but it works. And that's actually how hymnals are set up. In fact, in many hymnals, you'll find the same set of words sung to different tunes. And the way you do that, the way you match it up, is with the meter. Of course, the reason for this originally is so that a congregation could only need to know, especially one in the Reformation that is learning how to do this collectively, a congregation might only need to know 6 or 7 or 8 different tunes, and they could sing as many hymns as they could find to that set of tunes. What makes this work is that music is regularly structured, and you need the words to be regularly structured in the same manner to match up with the music. So I suppose the question is, if we're going to chant the Psalms, do we need a Psalter? And should we worry about it if we can't find one or can't get one? I'm going to give you my opinion, and it is just that. It is an opinion. My opinion is that a Psalter makes it easier to chant the Psalms in the manner in which we're learning to do it. But it is definitely not necessary. And here's why. We're not trying to match up a particular metered psalm with a particular tune. We are singing what are called psalm tones, and we haven't talked about that a whole lot yet. That'll be in a future video. But psalm tones have the quality of being somewhat variable in the words you say on particular notes. And so we're not trying to match up poetry to musical rhythm in the same manner that you would be if you're trying to write a hymn. So for psalm tones, it's not that important that we have a Psalter. Your favorite translation of the Psalms will work just fine. Now, with that said, I'm going to use a Psalter, and I do use a Psalter for a couple of reasons, most notably how the Psalter is organized, or how it organizes the lines and stanzas of the psalm themselves. And so it's not as important to me to have the metrical nature of the psalms preserved for chanting, right, as opposed to singing a hymn, a psalm set to a hymn tone, or a hymn tune, I should say. Psalm tone, hymn tune. The metered portion is not that important to me, but the organization is. Here's what I'm talking about. What you're seeing is an example of a Psalter. I've picked out Psalm 133 to talk about why a Psalter might be useful for us. Psalm 133 is one of the songs of ascent. Psalms 120 through 134 are called the Psalms of Ascent, or the Pilgrim Songs. My understanding is that they were often sung by pilgrims on their way up to Jerusalem. It's a gorgeous little section of the Psalms. I would encourage you to read through it, as I would encourage you to read through all Psalms. But the Psalter shows you, and this particular one, I should say, shows you this, which is called the psalm tone. We're going to deal with the psalm tone in a later video. Not all Psalters will match up psalm tones with particular psalms. This one does. We want to learn how to match up any psalm tone with any psalm, which is why we're doing this. But I just want to look at the words here and show you how they're organized. So let me just read the first line. Behold, how good and joyful a thing it is. And then there's a colon. Brethren, to dwell together in unity. And then the next one. It is like the precious ointment upon the head, line, that ran down unto the beard, colon, even unto Aaron's beard, line, and went down to the skirts of his clothing. So you should start to see some things in common. The lines here, I'm going to say we're going to ignore. I will deal with those in a separate video after we learn all the basics. This is sort of the next level. What these mean is sort of the next level class. And really, I don't ever pay attention to these. But the colon is what I want you to pay attention to. Now, in the Psalter we will eventually use, and in most modern Psalters that I've seen, this colon is actually an asterisk. They're going to form the same, or they're going to perform the same function. So don't worry about what it looks like. If you can identify the function of this, you will be able to figure out whatever symbol a particular Psalter has means. So what this does is divide the line into two portions. Now, if we look at the psalm tone, again, we're going to deal with this in a separate video, but notice it is also divided into two portions. Marked by this, we would call it a bar line today. And when the psalm tones were first written, it would have been something else. But the psalm tone is divided into two sections, and each verse or stanza, we'll say, is also divided into two sections. That becomes important. And that is why I think the Psalter is useful for us, even though it's not strictly necessary. Because we're going to talk about, we can talk about the meter of the psalm and everything else, but really what matters here is the structure, knowing where to match up these notes that I see to the words that I see. And so almost all Psalters are going to have something which indicates this division of the lines, which is important if we're going to divide up the music. If you don't want to use a Psalter, that's fine. You just have to do that yourself, which is honestly not that big a deal. But it does, if you're talking about 150 Psalms, represent a significant amount of work. So if people have done it for us, it's okay to take advantage of that. So if you've decided to use a Psalter, the next question is, where do I go about obtaining one? The one you just saw in the video was this. It's hard to see the title because it's faded, but this is called A Manual of Plainsong. This is one of the resources I first used when I was learning how to chant the Psalms. This one is edited by Briggs and Frere. It's actually quite a famous one. This one is revised by Arnold, and this was put out in the early 1900s, I believe. But that doesn't mean that the translation was done. The translation here is actually one of the most famous, probably the most famous English language Psalter, called the Coverdale Psalter. It was done a couple of hundred years ago with an eye towards singing in congregations. Now, some of the language is a bit archaic. That doesn't necessarily bother me, but some people, it might bother some people. If it doesn't bother you, you can find PDF copies of the Coverdale Psalter for free on the internet just with a simple Google search. The one I'm going to be using is actually an updated version that's based on the Coverdale Psalter, but with a few things changed to modernize the language. I'm going to use the Psalter that has been included in the 2019 Book of Common Prayer put out by the Anglican Church in North America, or the ACNA. This was a really intense revising of the Book of Common Prayer that's been used in the Episcopal Church for quite a while. This one was done to change some things that reflect the particular liturgical and theological viewpoint of the ACNA. And most importantly, for our purposes, they made the whole thing available for free as a PDF. That is quite remarkable. It represented an enormous amount of work and is quite extensive in its output. And to make it available for free for usage for private worship, I think is just outstanding. And so I'm going to include a link to the ACNA download page in the description of this video, where you can download not only the Psalms, but any parts of the Book of Common Prayer that you would like to. Things like the Great Litany, anything like that, if that strikes your fancy, to use for private devotions. It's pretty awesome. So that will be down in the bottom. If you find this really, really helpful, I would encourage you to perhaps send a donation to the ACNA because of this, because it was an enormous amount of work to put it together. And they have just released it for free, and I just find that outstanding. So that will be in the bottom. That's the one I'm going to be using in future videos. So I would at least recommend you get it and print out the Psalms that I'm going to be going through, where we learn how to actually chant them, so that you have something to follow along. And then if you decide you don't want to do that, you want to use a different Psalter or just your favorite translation of the Psalms, knock yourself out. There's not a whole lot of rules here. Remember, the purpose of this is to increase our devotion. So whichever set of Psalms is going to increase your devotion is the one you should use. But while we're learning, I would recommend that you get the ACNA so that we're all on the same page, quite literally and metaphorically. All right, God bless you, my friends. I will see you in the next video.